Okay, let's get started with the second session. Dr. Rita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sharmila. Good morning, colleagues and friends. Welcome to session number 2, titled Geopolitics and Economic Fragmentation. In the morning, we were talking about equality of citizenship, political freedom, and now we're going to be talking about economic opportunities as well as economic freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not need to say this, but we are all aware that our global order is in disarray. We have seen that in recent years, the global order, propagated by international standards and founded on principles of the rule of law, democracy, and international cooperation, seems to be increasingly illusory. We see that the escalating political uncertainty and as well as geopolitical fragmentation at a global scale resulting from the Russian and Ukraine conflict and also the growing US-China rivalry are currently shaping and also exerting influence on global politics as we know it. And in the midst of all of this disarray, we know that certain countries are discussing the possibility of decoupling of selected economies from China, while countries in this region have adopted a different policy on China, even going a step further to renew the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement to include sectors like e-commerce, especially. Additionally, when we look at the aftermath of the pandemic and its lockdown, some countries still have scars in the growth projection. The aftermath of the pandemic and its disruptions to supply chains have prompted countries to adopt a more protectionist and inward-looking stance, and this is again a concern for small open economies like Malaysia. So today, with the experts here, we will be discussing about how a smaller democratic and open economy like Malaysia, which is very much deeply integrated within the global supply chain network, can effectively maneuver these challenges while at the same time ensuring that we adhere to international best practices and commitments made through different treaties and also trade agreements. So we will also be talking about how these tension and the development in the global context are impacting economic opportunities and also economic freedom for smaller countries like Malaysia as well. So today we are joined by 3 experts. We have Dr. Hu from UKM. She's been teaching strategic studies and international relations for more than 15 years, so we look forward to learning a lot from you as well. Dr. Hu. So Dr. Hu's main research interest includes Korean Peninsula security issues, Malaysia's foreign and also defense policies, and nuclear security in Asia Pacific. So on my left, we have Angeline Tan from the Foreign Policy and Security Studies program at ISIS Malaysia. Her research covers East Asia's international relations with a particular focus on China. So we'll be directing all of the questions on China to you. And last but not least, we have Professor Evelyn from the Faculty of Business and Economics from the She is a trade economist, and her specialty is also in trade and services and non-tariff measures. So we look forward to be talking about trade diversification measures from Malaysia. So to get the ball rolling, may I invite all of the speakers to give a short opening remarks or statement on the global disarray, the global order disarray that we're in, and what would be Malaysia's outlook in the near term. Dr. Hu, would you like to start?
Thank you so much, Dr. Juwita, and also IDS for convening this conference and for the invitation to speak on this panel. So firstly, I think the disarray began before the pandemic started. So we witnessed the so-called US-China trade conflicts starting in the 2017. It began slightly earlier when the US felt the rise of China increasingly became a sort of a challenge to US primacy in the world and particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. So when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out in 2020, so a lot of blaming to one another that China, if not for China's mismanagement, the virus wouldn't spread worldwide. So countries are also forced to take a side. So whether you think China is to blame and so on and so forth, there is even a kind of a vaccine competition when it happened. Malaysia being Malaysia, so we don't choose side, we don't choose vaccines, we adopt as many as possible. So it actually, in a way, we express Malaysia's principle via inclusive engagement and acceptance. The result from our Ministry of Health is that if we combine Sinovac and Pfizer, it gives the best protection. So I think, and this is something that most of the global audience are not aware of. So US still believe that Pfizer is the way to go, and China still refuse to. So they do import Pfizer, for example, but there is a kind of a vaccine nationalism within the country, and if you also accepting Pfizer, you will be accusing as not loyal enough and things like that. So this is the current state of affairs, which is also reflected after the Russian-Ukraine war. So the war also was reflected upon in the way that which side do you stand? So if you stand with Ukraine, you are morally right, and so there is a kind of a condescending attitude if you don't condemn Russia, for example. So Malaysia was inadvertently part of that debate because we chose not to take side. And it's not just Malaysia, so as Indonesia, President Jokowi actually visited both Russia and Ukraine, so which is a very unprecedented move by a third country. And India as well refused to condemn Russia outright, but still also expressed solidarity with the Ukrainians. So I think that it is this type of a geopolitical polarization that led to the geoeconomic fragmentation that we are witnessing right now. So choose a side, are you with us or against us, is kind of a the global order disarray that we are talking about. But the world is not so much about black and white. It's actually a spectrum of shades in between. So in Professor Kwik Cheng Chui's article, Shades of Grey, he explains how smaller country like Malaysia and in Southeast Asia, we are trying to take different policy options to mitigate the risk. So if you put all of your egg in one basket, the risk is so much higher. So the opportunity for Malaysia then is to negotiate for better representation, politically and also diplomatically. And as for economy, we can ask for better market access and also to promote inclusive engagement with all coalition arrangement and blocs. So not just one for the other.
Thank you, Dr. Hu. And Jilin, your take on the theme.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Juwita, for giving me the floor. I'm also very honored to be sharing this all-female panel this morning on a Saturday morning on an issue like geopolitics. I think that does deserve a round of applause. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about how the US-China dynamic has been kind of affecting this global disarray. And the US-China competition, it's really the defining feature of today's geopolitics, right? There's really no running away from it. And it's playing out in so many different ways. the trade war, chips sanctions, tech rivalry, Taiwan Straits, the list goes on and on. It's a very multifaceted issue. And there's many ways to interpret what this actually is, right? Some people are talking about Huntington's clash of civilizations. Some people are talking about it as a Thucydides trap. Maybe it's a new Cold War. Honestly, I think these concepts are just too complex. There's a very simple way to look at it. This competition is driven by distrust. It came about because of distrust, and it's not able to make progress because of distrust. And what's examples of this, right? So Americans don't trust China, and that's one of the reasons why they put the chips ban, right, to prevent China's military power from advancing. Distrust from China is also what's causing them to have a more overtly supportive policy towards Taiwan. And similarly, if you look at China, their distrust also stems from this, from what they perceive as Washington's containment strategy. They see Washington trying to rally their allies to contain China from making its economic advancements. They see a proliferation of US-led mini-lateralisms in the Indo-Pacific. And so even if they try to push forward, you see Washington is very eager to improve relations and engage constructively. China responds with reservations. Distrust is what brought them to this situation. Distrust is what's preventing them from making progress. So the state of China, US-China relations is frosty, right? And it will likely remain so for quite some time. We are living in an age of uncertainty, and the only thing that is certain that is turbulence will continue to push forward, and this is the reality that we have to grapple with. So what are the responses to uncertainty that we've seen so far? Well, the US is trying to decouple. Europe is trying to de-risk. But if you notice, this kind of language isn't really adopted here in Southeast Asia because that's not our reality. We can't afford to disentangle ourselves from China, nor is it in our interest to. So instead, if you look into this region in Southeast Asia, the big question is, like Dr. Hu said, whose side are you going to choose? Whose side will Malaysia choose? Will ASEAN choose? And of course, this is a pressing question. It's a big question, but I actually think that it's not the most important question because great power competition can actually be good for us, right? We can operate in the gray areas. We can operate in the gray areas, and we can be creative about it, and we can play both sides. We can find the opportunities in between. So I think that while choosing a side, of course, it is a big problem, it's not our most urgent or pressing one. I think our most immediate problem is how to deal with uncertainty as a small power. It brings up the question, do we have the self-sufficiency to protect ourselves from shocks? It asks, how can we be risk-averse while trying to keep competitive? And more importantly, how do we make sure that as a small power, our voice and our concerns are not only heard but taken seriously? And when you consider all of these questions, it's really no wonder that so many countries are kind of turning inwards and strengthening from within. And of course, that's definitely what we need to do as well. We need to be able to protect ourselves from shocks, but we also need to enhance our competitiveness so that Malaysia becomes the preferred destination in Southeast Asia, so we can fill in the gaps. But when it comes to foreign policy, this is really where we have to put our principles into practice. So in the post-COVID foreign policy framework that was published in 2021 by the Malaysian government, it actually says that Malaysia follows a principle of non-alignment. And we should continue practicing this, and we have been, right? And I want to stress here that it's the principle of non-alignment. It shouldn't be confused with neutrality, because neutrality means that we have no opinions or no stake in the international issues that's going on. When you say that you're neutral, you're effectively removing yourself from the table. That's not what we're interested in here. We want to pursue non-alignment, where we can be fluid and creative in our decisions, where we're open to all options. And that requires us to have a very clear foreign policy where all of us are on the same page with what we want to achieve. We need to have a strong and empowered Wisma Putra to be able to navigate these challenges and identify the opportunities. And I think while we're talking about having a clear foreign policy, it would also help if our leaders can articulate where we stand, right? In this, because I have an idea about where Malaysia stands right now, but it would be better that I don't have to assume and that I know very clearly. So I guess that's where I would end my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Angeline. Prof. Evelyn?
Thank you so much, Dr. Juwita and IDAS for having me here. Coming back to your first point on the trade outlook, the way I look at it, supply chains were created those days under conditions of stability. So my first point would be today is that we live in a world where supply chains are prone to shocks. So we need to shift our mind in the way we think how decision-making is done along supply chains. Those days it was done along cost and quality. Now we have to weigh it against risk and resilience. So if you think of the two buzzwords when we link to supply chains, one is to de-risk. Every country in the world engaged in supply chains are trying to de-risk. The second one is to diversify. So these two notions have come, or concepts have come on board. But when we talk about diversify and de-risking, we tend to often look at COVID-19 followed, of course, supply chain shocks were already there during the crisis, followed by COVID-19, got exacerbated by all this geopolitics and so on. But we also need to factor in technology. Disruptive technology can be really powerful amidst all of this. Of course, it's linked to geopolitics and so on, but disruptive technology is at the core. So my first point would be, if you look at even existing studies, we talked a lot about non-tariff measures and behind-the-border measures, but disruptive technology is found to be an amplifier of the trade channel. So if we talk about tech decoupling, the way countries are instituting their own CHIPS Act, chip nationalism, and so on, this is something we need to worry about. So we moved from a period during the food security, during the COVID-19, when we talked about food nationalism and the weaponization of food trade as countries increase trade restrictions in the food sector. Today we see it shifting to the tech sector. So tech decoupling is a key issue. That's my first point. Second point, I would like to talk about industrial policy, and this I find very fascinating. As a trade economist, we always say that the international trade rules limit industrial policies. Like in this part of the world, we talk about rationalizing subsidies and so on, and less of state intervention in the market. But what we see today is the rise of industrial policies, contradictory to what we would expect under a multilateral context. And this rise of trade policies we see in the form of discriminatory subsidies, restrictions on two-way investments, the CHIP Act that we see in the US, even in the EU and China, subsidies being given. And interestingly, today is minerals, something that you never talked about, rare earth elements and so on. So we see this shift here, how countries are positioning themselves to find new ways of blocking technology, rare elements. They are important input into, they are an advanced material into high-tech sectors, right? So that's the second point I would look at is industrial policy. The debates those days was that, yes, you need a certain amount of industrial policy to spur transformation, increase productivity, but then again, the counter-arguments for active state intervention and industrial policy is that it may actually cause inefficiencies and sort of encourage corruption, right? But today we see countries moving or sort of regressing that way. Not really wrong to do that given the circumstances, because everybody wants to sort of protect their own domestic turf. The third I would like to talk about is data, and I think the second speaker alluded to in terms of trust. Today, trade is not about just goods and services, it's goods, services, and data. So what we see is when you talk about risk and resilience, data plays an important role. So it's not just about digital trade. Many people think that when it's data, it's about data flows through digital trade, through the transition to digitization and so on. But today, data is so important for us to nail what policy action is important for the health and survivability of firms. We have a lot of policies that are very aggregate in nature, but where is the data to actually identify where are the stresses for firms? So what we have is that visibility becomes very important along the supply chain. We need to showcase where are the impact factors, where are the stresses. Reporting becomes very important when we talk about sustainability targets. So that would be my third point on the influence of trade flows or data flows in merchandise trade. Yeah? And the fourth I would like to talk about is rules and norms. Very often when we think about EU, I mean, these are things that we never considered when we think about trade with the EU. How rules and norms and values have become so important when we talk about sustainable targets, right? A lot of the recent discussions, ESG, probably there's an overkill or it's overhyped here because they allude to what's happening in the automotive sector. It was quite interesting to read this consulting group that talked about the automotive sector. They're actually deprioritizing some of their sustainability targets because they were affected by the COVID-19, right? The automotive sector and suppliers. Then came semiconductor shortages, and so on. So now their focus is more on survivability, right, and continuing their operations. So there are even some statistics to say that in 2023, the number of companies deploying sustainability strategies had declined 9 to 11% because that's not at the forefront. So what we see is the supply chain shift from cost and quality to risk and resilience, putting sustainability targets at the far end. But that said, ESG is still important. So I would talk about this new paradigm under these contexts of disruption, shock-prone, de-risking, importance of data flows, the rise of industrial policies that all of us have to contend with. How do we optimize trade in this context? I would say visibility, reporting, more importantly, leveraging new technology is very important. And these are the buzzwords for market access into various platforms, using various free trade agreements, using various arrangements, and market access even to new countries with stringent requirements. So this would be my beginning comments, starting comments.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Evelyn. So a lot of food for thought and a lot of unbundling to do, but let me ask Dr. Hu, you mentioned that the global disarray or the global order was already in disarray before the pandemic. And to protect different countries, they have adopted protectionist policies. But in your view, is this protectionist wave temporary, or will it stay on as global disorder prevails?
Yes, I think to answer this question, I think firstly we must understand what are our principles and versus the realities that we are in. So if the principle to persist beyond this era of protectionism, we need inclusive engagement. But unfortunately, there are so many exclusive arrangements. So in the political, security, and military realm, we see Quad and then the AUKUS. So the high-level political and security arrangements prevail the more collective based consensus-making bodies such as United Nations, ASEAN even, and many more. So in the economic realm, we also see the emergence of, for example, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. So from your and also the other economists' understanding, is not a free trade agreement. So it is not as inclusive as we thought, and this is something that even though Malaysia has been invited to be part of, but we need to deliberate on that very carefully. And second, principle versus reality is that we need a united response to tackle either it is protectionism or the increasing diverge world in terms of blocks and norms as well. So what we have right now is diverged response. So from South China Sea, we don't see ASEAN be able to move forward on court and conduct negotiation with China. And in the economic realm, US, since they withdraw from TPP, for example, has not been part of any comprehensive economic agreement. So, except on the, just very recently when China announced the new map, so I think collectively the claimant states respond in unity. So, but does that united response actually would bring to a satisfactory solution to the issue? So that's yet remain to be seen. So thirdly, I think, Angeline very rightfully claimed one of my talking points. So trust building. So instead of building trust or involved in confidence building measures, we instead multiplying distrust. So not only between US, China, but also among, say, Southeast Asian countries, we should work together better to better manage Myanmar crisis, for example, and also the post-pandemic economic revitalization. But and instead, we are now in the unregulated spiral, so which makes the... We also have this tendency of looking away from the problems rather than face the problem and manage them. So I think pragmatism is very much needed. And many of the points raised by Professor Evelyn, for example, are the actions that nations can take, and especially for Malaysia, to overcome all of those. But I think lacking a good policy, for example, on rare earth. So I think not only at the state level, federal, we don't have a policy on rare earth elements. When our government a few months ago announced, oh, we have how many billions of rare earth element deposit, US Geological Survey came. China said we can work with you. And of course, so we are now again become the focus of the contention yet again. And yet we don't have a good policy to back up. How are we going to deal with this? Does, say, Perak, Johor, so would they independently at the subnational level make the dealing with the external partners to excavate rare earth mineral, for example. So this would actually pose a threat on our economic security, on our national cohesion in general. Not long ago, MITI just reviewed a new industrial master plan, but the plan also required 95 billion Malaysian ringgit investment. And how are we going to secure that? So I hope pragmatic plans are in place so that we can manage the challenges that we face.
Thank you, Dr. Hu. Going back to Angeline, you mentioned about distrust between China and the US. So how do you see the current tension unfolding in the next few years to come, and what needs to happen so that trust is instilled between these two major powers?
The very simple question, but very difficult to actually make it happen, is to engage in dialogue, right? I think everybody knows that this is a very simple question. But the question is, why is there so much reluctance to actually engage in dialogue when this answer is so apparent to everyone? And we see Washington keeps sending its high-level officials and diplomats to Beijing. They're trying to engage with them. And what I hear from the Americans is that they keep feeling a block. They are pointing fingers that China's not willing to talk to us, China's dodging our meetings, et cetera, et cetera. Why is that, right? And if I look at it from a Chinese perspective, it's because if you do engage, doesn't it make it look as if the US is winning? Doesn't it make it look as if the US has the upper hand and has the leverage here, and China is the one? You know, they still see themselves as a developing country, right? Not sure why. But if that's the case, they become that poster boy of, okay, I'm letting the superpower push me around. We're not standing up for the developing world as we're trying to be. So I think as much as I see that, you know, this is a way forward, the US trying to push forward, trying to engage, trying to make the first move, it's not that they should be making the first move. It's that their move needs to come across as sincere, maybe with some kind of humility, to make it palatable for the Chinese to want to cooperate. It can't make it seem as if the US has the upper hand here. Of course, that's not their intention, but it's coming across that way.
Thank you, Angeline. That is a very good answer to I understand now, a very important but difficult question. But coming back to that, Prof. Evelyn, so looking at the very far possibility of trust to be instilled between these two major powers, so it means that the trade tension will continue for some time. So what can Malaysia do to keep our trade activities vibrant and sustainable despite the distrust between major powers and also despite the protectionist wave that we see in different parts of the world?
Thank you, Dr. Juwita. We talked a lot about digital transition. Yeah, is it happening? Not quite so for the manufacturing sector because they make a large number of companies. In fact, when you look at the statistics, more than 50 million SMEs are using Facebook. That's more B2C. 70% is local customers, only 30% foreign. We just had a logistics conference, and there we had Alibaba.com there, and they were talking about SMEs getting on Alibaba.com. Of course, the fear is there. One is the cost, the fear of dependence on China is also there. But I think platforms like this are very essential, how the government can actually produce platforms for them to get on. Trust is a key issue to get on those platforms too, besides cost. So to me, going digital is imperative in the current context if you want to have a global reach in terms of, because what's happening is that they are actually reaching out to customers, but they're not reaching out to investors and suppliers. So the linkages need to come through B2B platforms. It can't be just B2C. So we are stuck in B2C kind of platforms when it comes to SMEs, right? That would be in the case of digitalization, but that has moved away. Today, everybody is talking about not just the digital transition, but the green transition because of the move towards this, because of the Russia-Ukraine war and how this has coerced countries to move into clean energy, and that's why you see related industries such as the demand for advanced materials, lithium, critical minerals are all coming on board. So this green transition is something that Malaysia should also look into. We are already quite there when it comes to solar power, renewable energy, but where do we go from solar power? Where do we go? We have a few winners in solar power. We are quite there, but where do we go from here? I kind of allude to what Singapore is actually suggesting, that we should leverage green power trading within the regional context. That could be one avenue in our green transition shift. Third, I would talk about the new industrial master plan. New industrial master plan advocates shifting from a sectoral kind, though they've earmarked a few sectors, to a kind of mission-based approach. Now, one thing that I like about this master plan, it actually recognizes horizontal actions in the form of taking up all sectors. Because today, when we talk about trade, we can't look at trade in isolation. We can't look at trade policies in isolation. Trade policies need to be embedded in a broader sort of development agenda because they are linked to like environment, human rights, labor rights, and so on. And also, trade is linked to other service providers. In fact, at the logistics conference, it was very interesting that the logistics recognized the links between logistics, trade, and manufacturing. You cannot disengage that. So if you talk about greening the manufacturing sector, greening trade, you also need to talk about greening the logistics sector. So that green transition is broad in the sense it cuts across horizontal sectors. The third one is I would like to talk about regional cooperation. It's been there, ASEAN has been there, but we have not really moved, yeah? So how do we go from here? Intra-regional trade is about 28%, simply because, as you mentioned, we can't really decouple. Our home market base is very small. So how do we leverage regional cooperation when it actually hasn't moved? We need to look at other forms of regional cooperation, or how do we look at regional cooperation or re-look at regional cooperation? We talked about streamlining regulations behind the border barriers, such as non-tariff measures, hasn't moved quite much. Now we talk about streamlining border regulations in the energy sector. So that's also coming on board. I don't know how much we can move. So regional cooperation, to me, has its limitations. This is something Malaysia needs to recognize. We cannot leverage on the ASEAN platform alone. So when we talk about diversity or diversifying our cooperation, we need to look at other platforms. And this is where the recent MOU signed with Singapore to address issues such as cybersecurity. These are important because sometimes we cannot move as a group. We know the disparate interests within the group. So sometimes we need to engage in multiple groups. Another one could be the DIPA, the ASEAN Digital. I think, so that could be another one. And the ATIGA, I'm not stand corrected whether it has been upgraded to include digital,
On its way to be upgraded.
on e-commerce and so on. So I would think that these regional cooperation is one. The fourth one I would think would be the sectors. NIMP has recognized some sectors. Of course, electronics has always been there. We've never upgraded. The same narratives of yesterday, we need to go up the value-added chain, remains today, and I believe will remain tomorrow if we do not engage FDI. We do not have the capacity. So selected FDI to come in to really tech and move up the sector. And today it's not just about E&E, it's about RE, renewable energy. So getting investors to come in. And as you rightfully pointed out, mineral reserves, they say the deficits of mineral reserves is about 732 billion in 2019 in Malaysia, not fully explored. Contentious issue, deals a lot with ESG compliance and so on, but it's something that we eventually have to move in. Because look at the speed of China. I mean, when you look at even EV, everyone thinks of EV as Tesla. But when I was looking at 3 large Chinese car makers, they have actually superseded the EV market compared to Tesla. Of course, 1 against 3. 4 producers, Chinese producers, conquer 63% of the lithium battery market. And they've also gone into downstream and upstream. We have a mining resource that is not explored, contentious, but something that we need to relook, because it's not only mining getting people on board, also moving downstream. It's not stopping just at mining those resources. So while today we talk about how supply chains have moved to friendly shoring, that I think IDAS has discussed quite a bit, friendly shoring, when we think of friendly shoring, the term was coined because US sort of is gravitating towards Canada and Mexico when they think of friendly shoring. But what about Malaysia engaging in this sort of concept of friendly shoring? Of course, with the Chinese and US, they have to tread a careful path, take a non-aligned posture, but the US is important and they are there in the Indo-Pacific, although we like to call it Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, which is not an FTA, it's a kind of we can look at it sort of like a public-private cooperation to see how we can leverage the incentives that the US is already giving to its FTA partners to mine mineral sources, right? Why not we tap that and bring that? And this is something that has already been recognized by Peterson Institute, and they have been like encouraging such a thing. So we need to shift our thinking on how we look at some of these resources, and we can't preserve them forever because we've got competitors coming on board. And if we don't do that, other countries within the region who have resources are going to tap into this ally shoring sort of a thing, yeah.
Thank you, Prof, for making that transition easier for me from Malaysia's aspiration to China's aspiration. So, Angeline, what is China's economic aspiration? And if I may, how will BRI come into play within those aspirations? Because Malaysia is also the recipients of many BRI funding and collaborations with China. So yeah, the floor is yours.
I think I'll answer the second question first. So in the eyes of Beijing, the BRI is live and well, but in reality, it is not live and well. At the moment in Malaysia, I sense that the BRI is a bit still. There's not much movement going on. There's also not much progress. And whatever shiny new things that the BRI introduced 10 odd years ago, 2013, the progress has been just too slow for them to actually be very proud of it and say that the BRI is a shining example. So they still continue to pay lip service to it, but whether or not it's actually made great strides, that's debatable here. And they've also not really introduced any new initiatives under the BRI. Having said that, China has also introduced quite a lot of new initiatives like the Global Development Initiative, which they're trying to push through a bit more. At the moment, it's still quite ambiguous what the global initiative means, but it doesn't mean BRI. In fact, it's designed in such a way that the BRI and the GDI, it's called, is supposed to go parallel to each other. So you have to see the two of them as complementary but separate. What's different is the BRI is much more bilateral. It's like China to Malaysia specifically, whereas the GDI is more of an alliance in a loose kind of term, because I'm not sure that China likes the term alliance, but it's a group of friends, basically, think of it that way. So you can see how they kind of complement each other, but it's completely separate. I think it's ambiguous right now where all of these is moving because of what China's economic state is currently, right? And that answers your first question. What is China's economic aspirations? And I mean, naturally, everybody wants your country's economy to be strong and thriving. But I think the understanding and definition of strong has changed through time. So 30 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, in China, strong and thriving meant double-digit economic growth. It meant being phenomenal when it comes to their economic activity. But today, because of the geopolitical environment, it's so different and it's so harsh now, so uncertain as well. Strong means resilient. Strong means having strong domestic capabilities. So that's also one of the reasons why this year their target for economic growth is very low. It's only 5.5%. And you do wonder, why are they not being more ambitious? Why are they setting their target so low? Everybody is very aware that currently China's economy is in crisis. They're spiraling downwards, and it's not looking good. Economists, politicians, investors, everyone is asking for more from China, right? The government needs to boost its economy, needs to do more. I'm sure people in Beijing, the people in power hear these concerns, and there must be a reason why they are not acting on it. And it's because their priorities have shifted. A strong China no longer means a double-digit growth China. It means a China that's able to withstand the pressures that's constantly coming in from Washington. That's what I think the state is right now.
Okay, thank you, Angeline. Dr. Hu, if I can just circle back to you and to talk about our foreign policies. What can we do, or what can Malaysia do to ensure that despite global instability, our foreign policies stay strategic? As mentioned by Angeline just now, it's a bit unclear what our foreign policies are to date. on certain issues. So I just wanted to see your take on this, on our foreign policies and our positions on different issues that are cropping up.
Thank you so much. So I think Malaysia's foreign policy principles has been consolidated since Tun Razak's time. So it was a time when we choose to be non-aligned, as Angeline has spoken about just now. So whenever we flaunt our non-aligned principle, our major powers partners get frustrated, so that means you're not going to do anything. So how can we be a more responsible, non-aligned partner? So I think firstly, our values should be aligned with our national interests, kepentingan negara. So I think first of all, economic security is at the forefront. So with that, we need to enhance trade and economic cooperation without any discriminatory position. So this is why when IPAF, we get invitation to join IPAF, we join, we are part of the founding ASEAN members who propose RCEP. We are also very involved in the TPP negotiations, now CPTPP. So I think we are very active in upholding that kind of a rules-based order by involving in multiple laws, treaties, and agreements. Secondly, I think for Malaysian security consideration, we do look at defending territorial integrity as one of our forefront foreign policy objective. This is why when it comes to South China Sea, Wisma Putra is the main agency together with our National Security Council to communicate not only with China, but also with fellow claimant states in Southeast Asia. So I think bilateral relations with our neighboring country is utmost important to Malaysia's survival. So that involves not only security cooperation, but also economic cooperation as well. So given how low intra-ASEAN trade is, there is so much more to be done. I think Singapore is the most involved when it comes to intra-ASEAN trade because they see the potential. So when I made proposal to apply for FRGS, for example, 3 years in a row, my proposal on intra-ASEAN integration was not accepted. So I think there is a need for Malaysian government to really identify what are the most urgent need to address, for example. So maybe they don't think intra-ASEAN trade or integration is important, but for those of us who are from the higher education or research community, we do think it is important and we hope that the government can take it seriously. Thirdly, how do we manage regional order amidst US-China rivalry, competition? So the relevant Malaysian foreign policy principle would be bilateral, multilateral nexus. So for example, we have bilateral relations with everyone in ASEAN. We also uphold ASEAN principle together as the cornerstone of each of the member states' foreign policy. And not only that, we also utilize ASEAN platforms such as ASEAN +3, ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asian Summit. So with that, we extended our bilateral and multilateralism with the major powers, including, I think we are such an inclusive regional organization because even competing powers can be seated together and discuss about difficult issues. That was the main purpose of ASEAN and later the ASEAN-related platform, because the main objective is to talk about difficult issues by sitting on the same table together. So multilateralism through various institutions outside of ASEAN is also very important. We advocate on Islamic solidarity. We also sit on the Human Rights Council at the moment. Counterterrorism has been our forte, so much so when Northeast Asian countries started to look into counterterrorism, they come to Malaysia, for example, to learn our best practices. So navigating major global strategic shift has been Malaysia's forte as well. Since before independence, we have maintained very good relations with United Kingdom, our colonial master. After independence, we also managed Indonesia's konfrontasi towards Malaysia, and it became the first country out of all of the Southeast Asian countries that we establish defense cooperation. So we always see opportunities in crisis. And I think that is the type of advantages via Malaysia's foreign policy principle that we can advance into this world.
Okay, thank you. From foreign policies to trade policies, Prof. Evelyn, again, there's talk about decoupling, and in this part of the world that is impossible and that's not part of our narrative. But what would Malaysia do in terms of trade diversification measures? Do we have plans on diversifying our products or even destinations for adding on, partner countries when it comes to free trade? Do we need to be thinking strategically of our sustainability as an small open economy, especially with the rise of trade tension and just a geopolitics tension in the medium to long term?
Okay, in terms of trade diversification, if you look at Malaysia's data on product and market diversification, we are actually quite a diversified economy. In fact, Heinrich Foundation, in its latest report, if I'm not mistaken, China, of course, is at the forefront for being the most diversified among 30 major economies. Malaysia is also there with, the usual index that they use is the Pfindal-Hirschman index to sort of tell you the closer it is to zero, the more diversified it is and less concentrated it is. And we are already below 0.15. We look at alternative statistics for the past 10 years, export diversification has marginally reduced, so has import diversification. But if you base year effects matter, if you go further back, 2000, and compare 2000 to about 2022, export side has become less diversified, marginally, from about, 0.28 to about 0.22. Now, that tells you that something is happening there, and there have been studies to tell that we have become more of a distribution center, so we have lost out in some segments of the electronic sector. If you deep dive into the electronic sector, I think Prof. Tam's paper tells you that about a few segments in the electronics where we have lost out, we have gone into mere distribution rather than becoming traders per se. So I think it is difficult to actually diversify. China has the means to diversify, having a large home market base. But then again, how do we diversify? One of the ways is preferential trade agreements. Of course, there are a lot of FTAs. Trade flows precede even signing of any FTA, but some FTAs that provide preferential market access would allow this form of diversification. I was looking at the logistics sector, and they talked about the RCEP per se, where you have cumulative rules of origin, and they looked at seaborne trade. So seaborne trade has actually increased and reached an index of 101.4, and a large segment of it came from the container section for the past 2 consecutive years. So RCEP gives you that sort of a possibility. But so we need to leverage on some of these I would say trade agreements for diversifying. The other one is the CPTPP, which has more binding commitments. I think in the last session I talked about the new markets, right? Canada, Mexico, and Peru, right? How all three together, we have more licenses issued compared to our traditional under COO, more COO, issued compared to the traditional partner, Japan. So that sort of is a good indication they're moving into these economies, right? We talk about timber, establishing timber connections with Chile, and so on. So PTAs give us that room, maybe not so much, some flexibility to sort of increase and move into products, increase into new markets. And the other day, I think, was it Australia, talked about engaging Malaysia more in agri-food. Yeah, so that's another potential, because today we talk about food security also as an issue, and we need to engage. Sometimes when we engage with these FTAs, we're not going to see a drastic increase in trade flows. What we're going to see is some form of capacity building and cooperation. So it's not just about numbers, yeah, because getting market access today is just not about meeting tariff requirements or non-tariff measures. It's a lot about accountability, responsible sourcing, goes all the way up to how you produce the goods. And we need a lot of capacity building and cooperation along those lines. And you know, the food sector is one of the sensitive sectors in global trade. So diversification could also happen through that manner. And another one is FDI. I made this comment on another platform, and I said we're not quite there, and I knew that those from the ministry were quite upset because they said foreign investment has been increasing in leaps and bounds. In fact, the latest figures show there's more than 17% rise in FDI in 2022, and the statistics quoted that investments increased in EV by 570%, and green investment in RE by 240%. Now, all these more than double-digit kind of figures gets us all excited, but we need to see our position also in relation to the region. Competition coexists with cooperation. That's something we need to also think of. When we look at this FDI, we only come third after Indonesia and Vietnam. So even though these figures look good, that inflow of FDI has been substantial in this region, we are going to capture a lot of this EV market, in the RE market, we also need to weigh in our strength against our regional competitors. So diversification, I would think, is very important for us to remain attractive and draw in FDI, because we are not quite there in the tech part. So selective FDI, such as like wafer fabrication into the RE sector, things that we can think of that will tech up our E&E, will get us to diversify our energy sector. So I would think FDI, capturing FTAs, not just for the sole intention of making inroads into new markets, but capacity building for harmonizing, or I would say streamlining a lot of cross-border regulations in data, in the energy sector, and also making the shifts that are needed for digital and green transition. But the digital thingy has been there for some time, not really moving at the pace that we expect. Even the logistics sector takes note that we really don't have the capacity. Ultimately, it comes down to human capital. I mean, being from the education sector, I think human capital is a big key factor in the economy. You can have all the infrastructure, if you do not have the human capital, I think it's hard to move, because when you talk about cybersecurity, we need actually good people that are also hackers could be, in fact, good. People with that kind of tech, who are tech savvy and so on. So it's still, everything goes back to in human capital. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. So we've been talking about US, China, Ukraine, Russia, and obviously there's an elephant in this room, and I think some of our speakers have brought this up, and it has been brought up in the Q&A questions here, and it's on ASEAN.